you for everyone who has joined us so far. If you were looking for the Pumpkin Grower Meetup, you are in the right place. So this is an event that Extension has been putting on in some capacity for the last 4 years, since 2019. So this will be our 4th year doing this. And a couple of times we've done it over Zoom, and a couple of times we've done it in person. Once we did it in September to show the results of a trial, and we were going to do it in September again this year because it worked out well before, but people seem to want a postseason virtual event. So that's what we're going with this year. So this gives us an opportunity to look back at this season as well. So the picture here, by the way, is the giant pumpkin that we grew on our extension team, and that picture was just taken yesterday when it was taken to the compost pile. All right, so just a few housekeeping things. This event is set to a meeting. It's not set to a webinar, and that means that everyone has an option to unmute yourselves. The reason we decided to do that is because a large part of this event today, especially the second hour, is meant for discussion. We want people to join in the conversation. So we wanted you to be able to unmute your mics, but only when you're ready to talk. So please try not to hit that unmute button until you're really ready to say something. The first hour, we're going to have 2 presentations, so those are going to be recorded. The second hour is not going to be recorded because we're having group discussions. And so the unmute button is here. We'll be doing a few poll questions throughout. And then when you have questions or have comments, and maybe you don't want to speak up, you can put those in the chat. Here's the agenda today. So first, we're going to have Jenna Price, who's a vegetable breeder from Sakata Seed America, and she's going to be giving us a talk. Well, I'll let her introduce herself more and what she's going to be speaking about. But Jenna and I got the opportunity to work together just a little bit this summer on a pumpkin trial in Minnesota, in Belle Plaine. And so that was really nice, and it was nice to connect with Jenna, and I asked her to come talk to us today. She has a wealth of knowledge about pumpkins. And then Charlie Rohwer from the U of M Southern Research and Outreach Center. He's a vegetable researcher, and he will be talking about a pumpkin trial that he did at the farm this summer. From 1 to 2, we're going to be going into breakout discussion. So this means we're splitting into smaller groups, so it's easier to have conversations where you can choose your topics between pest management, no-till pumpkins, and pumpkin sales and marketing strategies. So we want to get an idea now of where everybody here is from, whether you grow pumpkins or not, and then we want to hear which breakout discussions you think you're going to want to join later, just so we have an idea and can prepare. We're getting there. Looks like about half of the participants have voted. We have a lot of growers coming in from central Minnesota. So far, we don't have anybody from southeast Minnesota. We've got a few from the metro, a few from northeast, one from southwest Minnesota, but a lot of central. We'll leave this up just a few more seconds in case a couple more people are still clicking through. All right, still a lot of central Minnesota here. We were asking, how was your pumpkin harvest this year? Better than average, average, or below average. And it seems like so far the plurality, not a majority, but a plurality of growers are saying that their season was about average. 5 said the season was better than average, and a handful below average as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and Diane, can we end this poll? By the way, thanks to Diane from Extension for helping us out with this webinar today and keeping it running. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jenna. I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right, hello. As I get my screen shared here and get my presentation up. Let's see. Can you guys see that? Yes, okay. So I'm Jenna Price. I am the pumpkin breeder for Sakata America. I also work on Swiss chard, two crops that sometimes might not go together exactly breeding wise. However, the trialing cycles line up really nicely so that I have all the pumpkin trials in the fall, but for baby leaf beet and chard, most of that is grown on the West Coast, kind of all throughout the season. So there's 3 seasons. I usually do about 3 trials in California, and then 1 in Arizona every year because the winter growing area is kind of around the Yuma area. And then the Salinas Valley is where most baby leaf spinach and chard come from in the rest of the season. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself. I am actually originally from southern Minnesota. I grew up on a farm in between Janesville and Waseca. About 10 years ago, I moved to Washington to start working for a little company called Elf Christensen Seed Company. And in those years, they became Sakata. And so we have a research farm here it's in Mount Vernon, Washington. It's about an hour north of Seattle and about an hour south of the Canadian border. This is a really ideal location for some crops like seed production. So we produce a lot of spinach and Swiss chard and cabbage seed in this valley, along with broccoli. And actually, Sakata seed is best known for its broccoli seed production. So in the US, if you eat broccoli from the grocery store, they say there's about a 75% chance that it's Sakata broccoli. The main office for Sakata Seed America is located in Morgan Hill, California. We also have a few other locations in California. There's one in Woodland, and that's where I do most of my pumpkin trialing, and then another one in Salinas where we have cool season crops like Swiss chard, broccoli, and spinach. We have a few other locations in the US. We have a research station in Florida where they breed for things like peppers and tomatoes. And then we also have a production and research site in Yuma, Arizona. I put a few of our pumpkin varieties up just to see if growers here have seen them before. Things like Candy Corn Plus. Some of our smaller varieties are really popular. Jack Sprat is definitely our most popular pie-sized pumpkin. We have a few big ones like Captain Jack that have been around for a long time. I know I was at a pumpkin grower in Minnesota this year and saw someone with toad on their counter, and they were growing some flat white boar. And I'm guessing that maybe a lot of people haven't heard of Sakata seed that are direct growers because Sakata doesn't do any direct sales. So all of our sales are done through dealers. So you might find our seed in places like Johnny's or Kitazawa or Osborne. And usually that's what I hear if I go to a pumpkin patch. It will be, oh, I don't grow any Sakata varieties. I only grow Johnny's or something like that. And so we sell to seed dealers. We're not really set up to sell directly, and then they sell our product to the growers like you. So as a plant breeder, my main job is to create new varieties of pumpkins or of any crop that I might be working on that best suits growers and consumers. And in this case, pumpkins are really fun because there aren't a lot of targets for like the main varieties. And the targets are really, really straightforward generally. So for something like a jack-o'-lantern, that's what these breeding targets are for. So like sometimes we call that the 40 count because in like a more commercial situation, 40 of those pumpkins fit in a bin. And usually I'm looking for something with nice dark orange color, smooth skin that's round, a really strongly attached handle, and a handle that's big or is like the right size for that pumpkin. And really, when you pick up that handle, you want it well attached because when you're selling a pumpkin, you want the handle along with it, right? Another important target that I work on is powdery mildew resistance. And that is a really kind of fun, interesting disease resistance to work on because it's not often that you want something that you're breeding for something that's not just fully resistant to a disease. So for pumpkins, if you get full resistance, usually that means it's going to be too slow maturing. The vines won't go down when it's time to harvest. So what you're really looking for is kind of a high intermediate resistance. So something where maybe the vines will get it and it will kind of put the vines down so it's easier to harvest, but it doesn't move into the handle or the fruit and kind of melt the plant down too far. So how do we get to this nice big fruit with dark color and a big handle? So the first thing that we need to do is create some variation. So usually I will take something, a lot of times there's half the traits I need or one of the good traits I need in one parent or in one pumpkin somewhere, and then a new trait I need to intergress in. So to do that, I'll take something like a pumpkin with really nice dark skin, but kind of not a very good handle, and then cross it by something with a really nice big handle, but maybe doesn't have very good color. And in that way, I can create some variation, and that gives me room to select for the best traits to move forward with, to introduce something that performs even better than before or fills a niche that no one has filled before. So in this picture, you can see lots of variation that we've created over the years. That second picture from the left, that pumpkin is, probably fits in the palm of my hand, and the handle is just as big and wide as the pumpkin. We're always looking for variations in color, shape, and size. And along with that, there's many other diseases to breed for. So I mentioned I'm breeding for powdery mildew resistance, but I'm also doing some work with introgressing Phytophthora resistance and podavirus resistance like ZYMMV. And so there's a lot of room to move these new traits into things that are acceptable in the market or things that people are interested in buying and growing. So after that first cross that I make, I self it once, and then I get to this, what we call the F2 generation. And this is where you grow out a row of pumpkins and every single plant is different and everything is interesting, but probably 90% of it is not useful. And so over the course of many generations, then I'll start inbreeding. And so what that means is every year I have a row of pumpkins and I just start self-pollinating. And I'll kind of explain that process a little bit later. And slowly every year after I make these pollinations, I just pick the best fruit. I pick up that seed, I harvest those pumpkins, I clean the seed, and then I plant that seed next year. And slowly but surely, I'll make a line that's uniform and has something in it that's useful for us. So in the end, this would be what we would call an F8. So this would be 8 generations after that first hybrid. We have something that's uniform and that is ready, that's uniform and has the traits that we're looking for. So I mentioned that all of this is done by hand pollination. We have a few sites where we pollinate, but I'm going to focus on the one here in Washington because that's where I am right now. So generally in July for the entire month, we pollinate 6 days a week. There are thousands of plants, probably 2,000 plants we're doing every day. And there's a little picture of a little cotton bag. And so what we do is we cover the female flower and the male flower just the day before it opens, the flowers open. And you can see on the left there, that's a picture of a female flower. There's like a little pumpkin at the bottom. That's how you can tell the difference. And then on the day that you pollinate, you just rip the male flower off, pull the leaves or the petals off, and then put a little bit of pollen in and cover it with a bag again. So pollinating just one fruit is a 3-day process. So on the first day, this is a picture of a flower that's just about to open. It will probably open tomorrow, but in reality, this one actually is probably like later in the day. I couldn't find a good one for exactly tomorrow. So on the first day, you'll cover the female flower that will open tomorrow. And usually we also cover the male flower because bees will land on the males and kind of drop a little bit of extra pollen in there. And then we won't get the pollen that we want. On the second day, we take the bag off, we pollinate. So take the male, put pollen on the female flower, then we put the bag back on the female. And then on the third day, the female is no longer receptive to pollen. So we take the bag off, and usually we scratch a little X with our thumbs in the immature fruit, and it gets a tag on it that says what we've done. So sometimes we're making crosses and sometimes we're making selfs, depending on the point of those lines in the field. And then, so that's 30 days in July, usually around. So it's a lot of work. There's a lot of people here doing it. And then we'll harvest around September, make selections on we'll pick out the fruit that were good, the ones that we think are useful, leave the ones in the field that we don't think are gonna provide anything for the breeding program that we need. And then we have the winter to cut all the pumpkins open, get all the seed out, get it dried down into packets, labeled and inventoried before the next season. So there's a couple different kinds of product that like a grower would see. And so some pumpkins that you buy are open pollinated. So something from Sakata like flat white Boreford is an open pollinated variety. And that means that there's just kind of one population that we increase and we just sell that seed directly. And the population is pretty uniform. You can see in this picture, maybe some of the handles are a little bit of a different color. Maybe the size isn't quite as uniform as you might see in a hybrid. So generally the uniformity is a bit lower. There might be less disease resistance, because usually hybrid breeding is breeding parents with good traits and higher levels of disease resistance. But in the end, the seed is cheaper because you just have a population, you throw it in the field in a distance isolation or something like that, and then you put bees or have bees naturally come to the field. And so I did say though that you need a distance isolation. So when you're making pumpkin seed, I think we do like a 2-mile isolation between any other pumpkin seed field. And that also means that we have to check home gardeners at anyone's house where there might be pumpkins, because if you have an open field where you have bees, that means that those bees can take pollen from any pumpkin fruit that there is. And when you harvest that seed and grow it out, if there's been something growing close by where the bees have been visiting, you're going to have outcrosses and the wrong type growing. So when you see something that kind of looks like your variety, but not quite, generally that's what happened, as a bee kind of got into the isolation. That's not that there was something growing that shouldn't have been there. And then the other type of seed that you often see, and this is more and more common, I would say most varieties are hybrid. A lot of varieties, pumpkins still have more OPs than other crops, but definitely most companies are moving towards more hybrid varieties. So you'll see more hybrid seed. And so that means that there's a parent that we designate as the female, and it's going to be uniform all the way across. So maybe we have this parent that has really good color and not a great handle, but we're going to use that one as the female. And so we'll either hand pollinate and pick all the males off, or we'll use a chemical called Florel, where we can suppress the male flowers for a certain period of time, a few weeks, and only the females come. And then we'll have a male parent, and that male parent maybe has like a great handle and good attachment, like the picture here. And those are all uniformly the same. Every plant in that line is the same. And if we're using Florel, the chemical, we plant those two things in like a cage or in an isolation and put bees in, and the bees will carry the pollen from the male parent to the female. If you're doing hand pollination, you will just cover the female plants like I was describing before, cover those flowers, and then just pollinate with the male flower onto the female plant. And then you get this hybrid variety. Usually hybrids are a little bit more uniform than OPs. Often they have more disease resistance. That's often the point of like what a plant breeder is working on, to add something, to add value, to make it easier for a farmer to grow or make it hold better in the field. But that also usually results in a little bit more expensive seed, because it costs more to develop it, and it also costs more to make the seed in the end. So moving forward, how do we release a new OP or a new hybrid? It takes a lot of trialing. So this year, I was on the road between September 15th or 10th, I think, and October 10th, basically. More or less every single week, I was traveling to a different part of the country, visiting trials, taking data, meeting dealers and growers, finding out what people like and what was working and what wasn't working. So here, that might be a little small. Hopefully you can see it. You can see kind of what my trialing schedule looks like in the US. So I have about 100 varieties that go into what I call a first look trial. And this will be things that I made last year that I've never seen before. So for a plant breeder, that's like Christmas. Like we're always very excited to see what our new hybrids look like that we first made. And so I have a trial in the Midwest. I have one trial in the Midwest for that. I have one trial in California, one up here in the Pacific Northwest, and then I have one in the Southwest as well. So I get to see those things 4 times every year, like right out of the gate. And what I'm looking for is adaptability. Usually every grower has had some interesting season. The weather in these locations is very different always. And so I'll take data and I even do something easy like an overall score. When you walk up to it, are you impressed by it or not? And then I pull that overall score, and if it looks really good, if it looks like it's doing better than a check variety, say something like Gladiator, then I'll trial it again. And the next season, it will go into what I call these second look trials. So I have more of those, kind of the same trialing areas, but a few more on the East Coast as well. And then if it does well for a second year, or maybe sometimes it stays in second look trials for 2 or 3 years, we're looking at adaptability. This year, pumpkin trials everywhere were really difficult because everyone had a difficult season for a different reason in basically every region. Up here, it was incredibly cold in the spring. But if things do well for a year or 2 in the second look trials, then we'll move to pre-commercial, and that's where we'll put seed out with every dealer that we know, kind of get some longer strip trials. They'll be in with growers more. We'll spend more time visiting with growers, finding out, does this work for you? Is it holding? You know, where are the problems, or what is it doing for you? Is it good? So that's kind of the, this is a short presentation on like the short version of how we move things to commercial varieties and how we breed new things. But so that's the end. Thank you. Our farm manager likes to carve pumpkins every year. So this was his display last year. Are there any questions? Let's see.
All right, thanks, Jenna.
Yeah.
So I can read these off to you if
I can
that's
see
helpful.
them. I can see them here too.
Okay.
Yeah. So are there certain cucurbit weeds that can accidentally pollinate pumpkins? I cannot think of any. I don't have this problem anywhere. This is a really big problem with things like radish and brassicas generally. There are a lot of brassica weeds. As far as pumpkins, I can't think of anything offhand. Do you guys know of anything?
I mean, we've got a lot of wild cucumber in Minnesota, but I don't know that that would be a pollinator.
No, those won't pollinate pumpkins, luckily.
Yeah.
I see, is inflation having an effect on the cost of pumpkin or other seeds? Yes, definitely. A lot of that has to do with interruptions in shipping and the cost of shipping rising and the cost of fuel rising, and also the cost of labor around the world rising, including in the US, but also we produce in other parts of the world. And as all costs rise and like things like shipping get interrupted, for instance, like there were a lot of problems with like shipping via rail. And so we started air freighting things to get seed to growers and dealers on time for the growing season. And that adds a cost that then we recover somehow. Yes, can you talk about saving hybrid versus OP seed? Yes, so I showed that picture. I can actually pull that back up because I think that might help a little bit. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can get back so I can control that screen. There we go. So I was mentioning how to pollinate pumpkins earlier. And with an OP variety, if you cover the bag or have a nice isolation, and then hand pollinate with the pollen that is from that variety, you can, you go from plant to plant and you save that seed, you'll get the same variety back next year. And pretty much more or less, you'll get the same variety. You could accidentally push it in a direction. Breeders call that drift, where, maybe it's a little less tolerant to something, but generally you can save that seed And I think a lot of people who grow the big, like because Atlantic Giant is an OP variety. And usually a lot of times I've heard that growers pollinate their own and sometimes save the seed at the end. And that one you'll get back. If you do this with a hybrid, you'll get like a crazy, you'll get like this. Where is that picture? You'll get this back the next year. So you'll get an F2 of a hybrid, which is this like crazy variation that'll be all over the place. So, you know, if you're running a stand, that might be really interesting for you. If you're trying to get the same thing all the time, that will not work. You'll get a ton of variation and yeah, you won't know what you're going to have the next year. Let's see, next question. Other than large stems and color, what other trends or growing preferences do you see? So we've seen a lot of movement in the last few years of sort of more niche things. I would say the biggest growth I've seen in the niche markets is white pumpkins. We've seen a ton of people buying them. We see them all over people's porches. And then generally also like sort of stacking pumpkins. So pastel or different colors that stack on people's front porches and things like that. And then like another trend towards things that like we call kind of like table decorations. So small pumpkins that are unique and pretty that you can put like on your Thanksgiving table or Halloween in, you know, decorations like that. Any research to try to combat Phytophthora? Yes, I have a small part of my breeding program that is dedicated to breeding for Phytophthora resistance in pumpkins. I think it will take me a little while. Plant breeding, we have a joke here that we say plant breeders are patient. It takes a long time to come out with a new variety that will like perform in every other way that you expect, plus have Phytophthora resistance. But that is something that I'm working on, and it's moving faster than I expected it to, actually. So let's see. Oh, yeah, thank you. There are, in the southern US, there are wild peepos that can pollinate commercial peepos. Is there an optimum time of year to purchase seed? I would guess as far as like prices go, I would say really it depends on what you're trying to get. You know, if you go to a seed company like Johnny's or something and say they're out of Jack Sprat because you're trying to buy it in December, I would go back in like just before planting season. So like if you can wait as late as May, they might have it by then because there's production cycles happening in the background. And so we might be getting seed in from like the Southern Hemisphere in May. We need to get it clean, packaged, and then out to a company like Johnny's. So that would be the one thing is, you know, if a company is out of something, if you can wait till as close as your planting date to buy seed as possible because you really want something, it might show up. But other than that, early, if seed is there, earlier is better because you never know when a company is going to sell out. You know, it's often first come, first served. And there's a lot of background things happening with seed production that you might not know about, where like a variety is really short that year because, you know, the weather in China was bad when they were producing or something like that. Let's see. Can you talk about growing pumpkins on trellises? So I do pumpkins on trellises for breeding purposes, a very small amount. And actually, if anybody is doing it and has advice for me, I would love it. I am most successful with really small pumpkins. And so I just have a couple of lines of wire and some string going up, and then I just vine them up. And I have like little parachutes that hang down that support the females after I pollinate them. And then I spend time trying to make sure that they have enough of the right fertilizer. And then I use a chemical called Botran to kind of keep the like fungi from growing in the wet, because our winters here are really wet. So we combat like molds and stuff like that a lot in the winter. But I'm about to learn a lot about growing pumpkins in greenhouses because we have a large expansion coming. So hopefully next winter, you know, next year, maybe I'll have more to explain about that. Let's see. Ooh, someone grew Mrs. Wrinkles. That's great.
Right, I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay, great. Thank you. And any work on insect resistance? Yes, I'm working on specifically potyvirus resistance, which would be an insect, but there are a few other projects, and it's like actually a worldwide group with a university called Wageningen in the Netherlands, who are working directly on insect resistance. So that would be like a non-preference for insects, but it's a very early project. So it will be a long time before you get to something on your end.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenna.
Yeah, no problem.
That was great.
Cool.
So we're going to switch over to Charlie now.
Okay, I'm going to
So while Charlie gets his slides going, I'll just read you a quick bio of Charlie. So Charlie is a research scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center in Waseca. He's been studying vegetable and spice crops, which we just learned spice crops are ginger and hops, for about 11 years. He's designed, implemented, and analyzed results from collaborative and self-directed field experiments with brassicas, sweet corn, peas, carrots, tomatoes, pumpkins, and other vegetables. So Charlie knows a lot about vegetable crops, and he's going to share his most recent research with interseeding clover and pumpkins.
Unmute. There we go. Thanks, Natalie. Glad we could all find a date to do this. That's cool. Let me go ahead. Okay. So as Natalie said, I work at the Southern Research and Outreach Center. You probably have a research and outreach center near you. I'm at the one in Waseca, and I study vegetables. Mostly this part of the state down here is peas and sweet corn. So that's kind of mostly what I'm supposed to be doing, but I work on all kinds of vegetables too. And I got into this project because I've grown pumpkins for our research center just to have for decoration in the past. And everything, all the vegetables I grow exist in a system, just like you. Everything we grow exists in a system. You don't grow pumpkins and then throw the entire field away and start from scratch every year. It's a system. So I have to think about not just growing pumpkins here, but I think about what's going to be here next year. And usually for me, and for many other people too, presumably what I grow here, what I grow after vegetables is usually field corn. You see in the background, field corn, we have about 900 acres here. Most of it is field corn and soybeans. And so after pumpkins, I probably grow field corn. So this project came about because I started thinking, what can I do during or after pumpkins that will help the corn that comes after that? Or will help even the things that come after the corn? What can I do to improve the system beyond just growing pumpkins and then growing corn and then growing something else? And so I thought that clover might be a good way to improve the system. And intuitively, on the right, with all this clover growing, it's taking nitrogen out of the air and shoving it into the ground. It's doing great for next year's crop. And over here on the left is just pumpkins with some weeds. So you can, it's kind of intuitive that the clover would probably be better for next year's corn than the plots without the clover. But then we have to backtrack and realize we're also growing pumpkins this year. We have to figure out, can we grow clover between the rows without doing much to affect the pumpkins, but also benefit next year's crop? And that's the primary goal of this project I'm going to talk about. It's a 2-year project, and this was the first year. It's going to end up being a 3-year project, really, but it's a 2-year project for now. The goal is to find a clover that will fix lots of nitrogen, will grow well, but doesn't interfere with pumpkin yield. And I need to do this 2 or 3 year project first, because the project I really, really want to do is grow how much I really want to study how much less nitrogen you would apply to field corn after pumpkins, or sweet corn. You could grow sweet corn too. How much less nitrogen do you grow, or do you need to add after pumpkins if you grow clover between the pumpkins? And to do that, I need to find out which clover to grow. There are lots of different clovers. Figure out a system that works without impacting the pumpkins too much. And I won't get into all the clovers I tried, because spoiler alert, didn't work great. but I did learn some things. I don't have any kind of fancy planting anything, so it's all hand planted. On 23rd of May, I planted. I used cotton candy pumpkins because I wanted something that wasn't too big, nothing that was too small. I wanted kind of a medium-sized pumpkin. Annie recommended cotton candy. It grew pretty well for us. Our staff certainly liked it. You can see in relation to Jenna's talk, there was some variability in some of the plots with the seed. So it wasn't great seed, but most of the pumpkins were white and appropriate size. And I only put herbicide on top of the rows. I use strategy herbicide on top of the rows. And that's because I want to grow clover between the rows. And I didn't know if if we use herbicide at pumpkin planting and then plant clover 4 weeks later, would that herbicide be bad for the clover? I didn't know, so I only used herbicide on top of the pumpkin rows. The first problem I ran into is, so the white line is precipitation. I planted right here. We got some rain right after planting. Temperatures were cold, got warm, and then stayed not warm. And what actually happened, we got a lot of seed corn maggots and some rodent damage. So I planted again. 14th of June, I planted on the same rows, same variety. And that was after a big rain, so there was soil moisture. The temperature stayed pretty warm. Germination was much better. Just the plot setup, the rows were 10 feet apart. And for the future, I'm probably going to go more narrow rows for the cotton candy. The vines weren't as vigorous as I expected they might, or as other varieties. In the background here is Kratos pumpkins that were much bigger. That was just a little bit of extra pumpkin space back here. I planted Kratos. And here's the cotton candy up front here. For each plot I did, each different treatment, there were 3 rows, 1, 2, 3 rows, 18 feet long, with 10 feet between each row. I had 16 different treatments. There were 2 controls where we did not plant clover and we hand weeded everything in there. And then there were 14 different clover treatments, mixes of clovers, different varieties of clovers, different species. And I did this whole thing 3 times in 3 separate parts of our fields. So this just illustrates that 3 replicates, 1, 2, and 3. There were 16 treatments in each replicate, and each treatment had 1, 2, 3 rows. It was 3 rows wide and 18 feet long. That's just what the experiment looked like, kind of. The previous year's crop was different. They were planted in different parts of the fields. And then the end of June, I planted clover between the rows. I used a push seeder, a Jang JP6 push seeder. It plants 1 to 6 rows, and you can get different wheels for seeding. So I calibrated this for all the different clovers I used. Got different seed wheels for different size seeds. It generally worked pretty well. But before the clover came up, there were weeds. You can see all the little green things here are weeds coming up. We had tilled between the rows and weeds were coming up, not unexpected. So we burned them off with a propane weeder before the clover came up. And as I said, it didn't work out great. And I'll go over each replicate because they all didn't work out great differently. So in this one, you see there's some clover coming up here, bits of clover, but everything you see pretty much that's green, that's not a pumpkin, is purslane. We had some Venice mallow here too, but it's a lot of purslane. The clover came up okay. It was just outcompeted by the purslane. Pretty good. Our second rep, similar, except instead of purslane, it was water hemp. Lots of water hemp and more Venice mallow. Again, the clover came up. It just wasn't able to compete as well with these super vigorous weeds. But in the third replicate, it worked. So this is one of the clover mixes we had. Again, you can see the row of pumpkins. Where's my pointer? Nope. You can see the row of pumpkins. Here's a row. Here's a row. The clover is planted between the rows. It's looking good. There are some weeds. This was not a weed study. So there were some weeds that came up still. Again, we did not use herbicides between the rows. Here's a different clover treatment. You can see the clover looks great. And this illustrates the idea that I was looking for. I want something that will grow under the pumpkin leaves, and so will tolerate the shade of being under pumpkins. But then at the end of the season, when the leaves die, the clover will be there and hold on to the soil. It'll be there in the fall and stay green for a bit after the pumpkin leaves senesce. As I said, the clover did the best in the third replicate. It was kind of a low spot in our field, and it probably stayed wet a little bit longer. The clover seeds are generally pretty tiny, and could be that the clover grew well because it was a lower spot and stayed wet longer. We had a fairly dry year throughout most of the summer. We're not as bad of a drought as much of central Minnesota and Twin Cities, but it's getting worse as we speak. Okay, so in each replicate, there were 2 controls, as I mentioned, where we hand weeded everything. We did not plant clover, so there should have been not a lot growing there. The number of fruits from each replicate, it was 2,700 fruits in this replicate with all the water hemp, and it was up to 4,000 in this replicate with a lot of purslane. And the yield was between 19,000 and 30,000 pounds per acre. And average fruit size, it didn't matter. The treatment didn't matter. Nothing affected fruit size really, and it was all about 7 pounds per fruit, reasonable for this variety. Okay, let me move my controller. Well, okay. So I'm going to show you some data. I grouped the clovers into, we used a few different white clovers, a few different red clovers, some mixed treatments, and we compared everything to the controls within each replicate. So this line here represents the control, the plot that we hand weeded. And if the clover did better than the control, you would find the data over here. If the clover did worse than control, you would find it on this side of the line. And what we found, these bars are confidence intervals. Basically, if this bar overlaps this red line, it really wasn't much different from control. And you can see the varieties of clover we used weren't all that different from control. But remember, in 2/3 of our plots, we didn't really get a whole lot of clover anyway. What we got was weeds. So I went out and I sampled biomass, how much stuff was there between the rows. I just used this, basically a big rectangle, about 6 square feet. I harvested everything in there, dried it, and weighed it. I didn't separate it by weeds, by clover, by anything. I weighed it. And so we can look at how the amount of stuff between the rows affected yield, irrespective of what that stuff was. This dashed line is the control. So again, if yield was better than control, we would find the data up here. If yield was worse than control, we would find the data down here. And what we would generally expect is, as you get more stuff growing between the rows, the yield would go down. And that's generally what we saw. With more stuff between the rows, yield goes down. But this isn't a study to look at biomass or the amount of stuff between the rows. It's to look at clover. So I'm going to focus on that third rep, the one that had the good-looking clover. And here's the data from that. Again, these are each data point is a different clover variety or treatment. And again, this is the control, this dashed line. So any data points above here got better yield. Data points below here got worse yield than the control. And this one up here, I think is kind of an outlier. I don't think it's a real good data point. It's just one plot, and that plot was a mix of 3 different clovers. There's no reason the yield should be that much better than the control. I think that's kind of an anomaly. What I am interested in is this data point right here. Stuff like this. Stuff that this made 4 to 5 tons of dry matter, and its yield really was not different from the control. That's the kind of thing that is interesting to me. That plot was this one I showed you earlier, crimson clover. This variety of clover stays kind of short. It's sometimes grown between rows of corn during the season, so it tolerates shade okay, tolerates some traffic okay, and it looked pretty nice here. So that's one that I'm going to focus on in future trials here. Oh, one thing I also should mention is when I was harvesting these pumpkins, I noticed a lot of the pumpkins tended to be in the planted row and not in between the rows. And it could be because I planted the clover too early in the season and it got big and vigorous and the pumpkins just kind of tried to stay within their rows. Another thing is if the clover was big and tall, like this, Berseem clover, really vigorous, big and tall, the pumpkins tended to stay within the planted row. Also, it was harder to find the pumpkins in here. As Jenna said, you want the leaves to fall off kind of, or to senesce a little bit so you can find the pumpkins easier. Well, this clover stayed green for kind of a long time and it was harder to find the pumpkins. As I mentioned earlier, we did not put herbicides between the rows because I didn't know if the herbicides would affect the clover. And here's some common pumpkin herbicides, pre-emergence herbicides. And I talked to a couple of agronomists I work with, asked them, do you think these would affect the clover? If I spray these and then 4 weeks later, for example, plant clover, would they be bad for the clover? And generally they said they should be fine, but test them because we don't know. So that's what I did. I sprayed these herbicides in small plots and then planted the clover about 4 weeks later on those plots. And I did it in 2 locations. Here's Waseca down here. I did it on our soil, which is a heavy clay loam soil. But I also did it on farm at Goulden Farms in New Ulm. And here's a picture of their farm. This is not, it rained a couple days earlier, but this is sand. And so this is just, it's like a beach here. This is very sandy soil. And so each plot was a rectangle between these stakes that I sprayed with something, one of those 5 herbicides. And there's also plots out here where I sprayed no herbicide just to make sure that the clover would come up. And again, I used our 6-row push seeder to plant 6 different species of clover. The white clover, I'll say the white clover did not come up. I'm done with white clover because it didn't germinate very well anywhere. So I'm not using white clover anymore. So basically there are only 4 clovers that we were any good in this study. Also, this trial on this sandy soil, the clover came up, but I never got any data because it stopped raining and the clover all died. The soil is very sandy, and I think that's why the clover died. By the end of the year, there was nothing left. But in Waseca, it worked out. It looked nice. And again, this red line is the control, and all of these treatments, all of these herbicide treatments are compared to the control, how vigorous was the clover. And again, all of these bars overlap with this control. So basically there was no big difference. It could be, maybe there was a trend, maybe Sandia was somewhat damaging to the clover, but can't say for sure. But the rest of these, no problem. And the 4 species of clover, again, none were any worse than the control. So there were no interactions between the clover species and it's not like Persian clover did worse with dual 2 magnum. Nope, they were all, nothing was really affected by the herbicides. So that's great, good to know. Some general things I learned is that the more biomass there is between the rows, the lower the pumpkin yield. That's not really anything new. If you have tons of weeds between the rows, you're gonna get less yield. White clovers didn't germinate well, I'm done with them. Red clover varieties were similar to each other. I think I had 4 or 5 different varieties of red clover. I'm just gonna stick with one. This right here is Persian clover. It's a variety called Enhance. It's not really common around here yet, but it looked great, it grew well, and it had flowers. and which could be good, could be bad. Maybe if there are flowers in between the pumpkin rows, it'll distract the bees, or I don't know. So we're going to continue looking at that one. Berseem clover was tall and dense. That's that one I showed you that was easy to lose the pumpkins. Crimson clover was short and dense, looked great. Another thing I learned, don't rush planting. I planted too early, the soil stayed cold. That's obvious though. And here again is generally what I'm looking for. The vines are all dead, but the clover is growing great. And that's what's going to be good for next year's crop. Next year, I'm going to, in addition to cotton candy, here's the cotton candy back here. I'm going to do this trial with Kratos because just in an unreplicated trial, you see clover growing under the leaves. Some pumpkins have different leaf structure, different structure. Kratos is big and tall with a dense canopy. So maybe some clover that might be big and dense would not compete much with Kratos, but it would compete too much with cotton candy. I'm going to stick to 4 clover varieties. And I'm going to use herbicides over everything, just because I have some confidence that it won't damage the clover. And this was funded by the Minnesota Department of Ag, a Sustainable Ag Demonstration Grant for 2 years. But again, I'm probably going to extend it to 3 because this year didn't work out great. You can follow me on Twitter. I'll put pictures and updates and stuff there. And I'll look through the chat for questions.
I can grab them for you, Charlie.
Oh, great.
Thank you for what a trialing year for trial. Lots of.
It always is.
Okay, so some questions in the chat. So we saw a lot about weeds in this one. How about other pests, especially deer, who can really love clover? Were deer any issue for you, or how do you foresee deer interacting with this idea?
I'm very lucky to not have deer at our site. There was one year where I had deer lay down on a sweet corn plot, but otherwise I don't have deer issues. So that's a good point because clover is often used in food plots or as forage for. So yeah, I'm fortunate to not have that problem. And it could be a problem, yes.
Okay. Lucky one problem you don't have.
Yeah.
A question here about combining clover and fescue to maybe get more weed suppression. Thoughts on that?
I think that's a great idea. Clover isn't super vigorous when it germinates, so combining it with something else that's more vigorous that can help early in the clover season would be useful, I would think. I'm going to focus on clovers for now, but yeah, I think it would be useful.
Okay, it looks like we have one more question in the chat. Again, if anyone else has one, feel free to pop it in there and I will bring it into the light. How about germination rates? What was your average germination rate for the non-white clovers?
Okay. Germination rate. I don't have the actual rate, but here are the control plots from that herbicide study. We counted the number of plants on the control plots in 80 centimeter distance. And here are the number of seeds we got. And this was, I mean, this Berseem, the Berseem had one plot that was really low, but otherwise this was generally within what we might expect for germination for these varieties, for these species.
Okay.
And again, the cedar was calibrated based on commercial recommendations, pounds per acre of all of these seeds. So this is what we got. Some varieties have more hard seed, or some species have more hard seed than other. So the white clover that we planted, I'm sure we'll get more coming up next year, things like that. Also the Persian clover self-seeds, the crimson clover, flower, or may self-seed, I should say. The crimson clover, there were some flowers. So it might be that this self-seeds and comes back up next year too. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I have a quick question. This is Jenna.
Go
Price.
for it, Jenna.
Charlie, I don't know cotton candy that well. I haven't grown it that much, but do you think there's a chance that that the vine, like you didn't set fruit on the vines actually because of like light sandia damage in the row? Like it could have shortened the vines a little bit and kept them from setting farther out. Like I don't know if cotton candy normally sets around the crown or sets far out on the vine, but just a
Yeah,
thought.
that's a good question. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
I've never grown cotton candy before, so I don't. We did have our control plots, but I guess I didn't look at where the fruit were set on the plants in those control plots compared to the other plots.
Is your
So, yeah.
control plot have Sandia in the row in the
No,
planting
it's
row
strategy.
still?
It was not Sandia, it was strategy.
Oh, strategy, sorry, in the planting
Yeah.
row still.
It did,
Anyway,
yeah.
it's just something, and I have no idea if like, I mean, you could probably tell if you saw a lot of female flowers and then they just kind of like rotted off. But, you know, I don't know. I don't know that variety that well either. It's just something to pay attention to a little bit.
Yeah. I don't have beehives, and again, this exists mostly in a field corn and soybean context. So, but we did have pollination that was fine and normal in our tomatoes this year, and so
Yeah, I would think with all the clover too, you should be attracting plenty of bees.
yeah.
Okay, we got time for one more question. I'm pulling it from the chat. So crimson clover can be seeded later in the summer, according to the Midwest Cover Crop Council. Do you think pumpkin production would allow for a cover crop like that to be seeded in August, or do you think it'd be too hard to get into the field and in between the rows to seed during that time?
If you can, one of the problems with planting cover crops mid-season without drilling it is that it requires timely rainfall. And these seeds are so tiny often. The crimson clover is a little bit bigger, I guess. But so if it's timely rainfall, sure. One demonstration I guess I did this year is I grew watermelon, and in August I went out and broadcast lentils. And lentils, the seeds are a little bit bigger than clover, so I expected that they would trickle down through the watermelon leaves, hit the soil, and they looked pretty good actually. Once the watermelon had died, pretty much everything green in the field was lentils, and it worked out pretty well. So maybe not with, I mean, maybe crimson clover, sure, broadcasting if you get timely rain, but I don't need to limit myself to clover necessarily either.
What a delicious combo of lentils and watermelon. All right. Thank you, Charlie, for that. We're now going to move into the next part of the meeting. So I'm going to pass it back to Annie.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Marissa and everybody. Thanks, Charlie and Jenna, for your talks, and Natalie helping with the Q&A as well. Charlie, I liked, the aspects of your talk where you were talking about things that don't work, because I think sometimes it's hard for extension people and growers to figure out if something has already been tried and didn't work, because often it's not reported. And so I think it's really important to talk about what doesn't work too, so that somebody might not go and, try it on their own. So thank you for sharing, both the successful and the unsuccessful parts of your trial. So now we're going to move into the second part of this meeting, the breakout discussions. And so when you guys filled out that poll at the beginning, telling us which topics you were interested in, almost everybody said they were interested in the pest management topic.